Before we begin, do you know I have a brand new YouTube channel called the Shadlands? But what is the Shadlands, I hear you asking? Well, if you love the Shadiversity content, you will love the Shadlands content because it's basically the same, except it is made to cut to the chase and straight to the point. With recuts of older videos that you've probably never seen before, made to be shorter and easier to consume, as well as brand new exclusive content that you will not find on the Shadiversity YouTube channel. All made in the focus of this new channel, easier to consume content, because even though I love the detail and deep dives that we do here on Shadiversity, some people just don't have the time to watch such long videos. So check out the Shadlands to catch classic Shadiversity content made easier to consume, as well as brand new exclusive content where we cut to the chase and get straight to the point.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and it's my impression as I see how the medieval period is adapted into not only pop culture, but just medieval enthusiast practice, that the arming sword gets a bit of neglect. Now, I'm not saying completely, because of course there are a lot of people just practicing arming sword, HEMA, and enjoying it, and it's being seen in pop culture and stuff, but there is this trend that when people opt for, like, if they're going to make a sword character, or we do, cutting tests and cutting tournaments, that usually the sword that gets a lot more attention is the longsword. And I get that. I love the longsword. Longsword looks great on your hip, and it's, in terms of usage, I find using a longsword easier than an arming sword, okay? A longsword, on average, only weighs 50% more than your standard arming sword. But as soon as you then are able to apply two hands to maneuver it around, it actually feels lighter in your hand. Yes, it's heavier, but with two hands it feels lighter than using a single-handed arming sword in one hand. And with that kind of easy use, the extra leverage and speed really attracts me to two-handed swords. It's also interesting the way arming swords, one-handed swords essentially, versus two-handed long swords, are adapted into pop culture and video games, where the arming sword seems to get such a damage nerf in many video games and role-playing games that barely anyone uses them. In fact, in most cases, if people are going to be using a one-handed sword, they would often go for the bastard sword. In a lot of video games, role-playing games, the bastard sword does more damage, and that's kind of one of the issues I want to raise, because it depends on the type of arming sword. This bastard sword here is a beast. We love it. I love it. I've used this so much. It's survived so much punishment, and what really makes this sword perform is it's got a great balance one-handed, and when you put two hands on it, it becomes very maneuverable and usable. But in terms of saying, is, say, a bastard sword always better than arming sword, really depends on the type of arming sword. That's where I think sometimes we might get the wrong perception, especially when we adapt these things into fantasy, pop culture, video games, and so on. And also in use. This arming sword here is made by Todd Cutler, friend of the channel, right? You can check him out at Todd's workshop. And I had an opportunity to hang out with Todd, and I purchased this from him when I was there, one of his direct line swords. And the reason why I purchased it is because of this design. Have a comparison between this style of arming sword versus the other type. Now, if anyone is familiar with swords generally, you'll understand sword designs, they exist on a spectrum. We have specific categories, but within those categories there's a lot of movement, and then the transition between one category to another becomes very grey. Like, how big does a knife need to be, a dagger, before it's a short sword? And how big is a short sword before it transitions into arming sword? And when you have one that's sitting right on the line, it's essentially both. It's either a really big short sword, or it's a very short arming sword. And so understanding kind of the fact that swords exist on a spectrum, you can see that there are many different designs. Now have a look at this blade profile on the Todd Cutler arming sword and compare it to the blade profile of this bastard sword that we love so much. There's a bit of similarity here, isn't there? This sword cuts and swings so well, right, that I love it. Now, if these swords were adapted into, say, a role-playing game, the bastard sword would always be doing more damage. when actually this arming sword is easily, we've tested it out, this thing is a beast, right? Really, really good stuff. This arming sword can easily do as much damage in one hand as this Spartan sword. And here is the thing that some people don't actually get. This arming sword right here cuts better than this long sword that I'm holding in my other hand. It's one of my favorite long swords, right? And looking at reviews of one of these designs in action, Medieval Review has a full review of this exact longsword, not the one I'm holding, same design model, right? And it actually cut much better than people kind of assume with it being so narrow, okay? So it cuts well, but you can kind of see the arming sword, why it might have a bit of an advantage in the cut. Now, this is not a heavy or unwieldy sword, right? When it comes to swords, it's actually not necessarily about overall weight. The thing that really surprises a lot of people when they pick up this Honshu, they call it the single-handed broadsword from Honshu, right? Is they're surprised at how heavy it is when they weigh it. But when you hold it, it doesn't feel heavy because the balance is just so perfect with this sword. And as a result, it actually feels like a really, really nimble one-handed sword as a result. And you can use it one hand perfectly well, okay? That's all due to balance. This sword weighs 1.7 kilos. That is 500 grams more than my longsword here. This longsword, 1.2 kilos. Super nimble, super quick, right? This is a two-handed sword, 1.2 kilos. This Spartan sword, which can be used very effectively in one hand, 1.7 kilos. And it doesn't feel that way because the weight is so well balanced. And so the idea that arming swords will just do less damage and cut less effectively than other types of two-handed swords just because they're two-handed swords is completely false. And it is reflected so much in video games and pop culture generally as well. Role-playing games are a big result of this, where two-handed weapons just do more damage, when this one-handed sword, this arming sword, can wreck certain two-handed swords. In actual fact, this is like one of my favorite arming sword profiles and designs. That's what I mean where arming swords kind of get overlooked with how insanely awesome and serious they are. Like this arming sword here can, in one hand, can cut better than many types of katanas. We've tested this. This thing is just absolutely gorgeous, right? Yet in role-playing games and video games, like a good example, Baldur's Gate 3. It seems like arming swords are so disregarded in role-playing games, they didn't even include this type of sword in the game at all. Arming swords are not existent. It goes short sword to long sword, and their kind of version of long sword is a one-handed or two-handed weapon, which is essentially kind of correct, right? That you can use long swords one-handed, but this is the only option in the entire game. If they were going to do that, they should actually just include arming swords with the same statistics as long swords and just call them cruciform sword, right? That's what cruciform means, crossguard. These are cruciform style swords, right? And because there's such a range where this one can do as much damage as this one, right? And you can use arming swords in two hands, right? And so the kind of crossover between arming sword and long sword, because you can absolutely use them in two hands, and you can absolutely use long swords in one hand, the best way to include or incorporate them into role-play games, video games, is just give them the same stats then, and based on either if there's a unique style, you could modify it a bit, like this one gets a bonus on slashing attacks, or this one gets a bonus on thrusting, but generally, same stats you can choose to use in one hand or two. And that would kind of bring their prominence in pop culture back a bit more. Now, in terms of our utilization in other things, I do not see many cutting, competitions with arming swords. And, it's like, I understand, because I love long swords, and I do generally prefer them. But in terms of swords that have been used in self-defense historically, the arming sword is actually used more often than the long sword. Okay, now the conjunction, the way you would use an arming sword for self-defense is the good old sword and buckler. full treatises. Now, sword and buckler does get a lot of attention in HEMA, thank goodness, because it is a deadly and awesome combination. Now, sword and shield is even bigger and better, but it's a little harder to walk around with a full-blown heater shield or large round shield, where the buckler, just like that. This is the equipment that a lot of regular people, when I say regular people, you know, if they're going to be carrying swords, right? And long swords are interesting when they assume that long swords were only ever brought, or even just more often used by knights and noblemen. And they say that there were laws restricting people from ever using long swords. No. What actually was the case is that in the areas where sword carrying was restricted, like in cities, and there are cases where sword wearing was restricted in Italy, England, not so much in Germany, depending on the period. Late medieval Germany, it was actually a requirement for most citizens to carry arms, but there were some cities that did have restrictions even in Germany. And when those restrictions were in place, it wasn't by sword type, it was by length of blade. They would even have a blade, usually a knife or anything, hanging on the entrance to the city, right? That indicated the legal length of blade that you were allowed to carry. If you were a nobleman who had more legal privileges, including knights, you had a higher likelihood of being able to be above that restriction, which meant that you could easily get away with carrying a longsword. It wasn't illegal for many commoners and peasants to own longswords and even carry them out in the world, but if they did come into areas where they were restricted, length would be the thing that would restrict them, and so what would they more often carry then? Shorter swords, which would give them the allowance. Now, sometimes these were arming sword length, more often they were shorter even, but that's why it's more associated that regular common people would carry arming swords or equivalent one-handed swords, where the idea of the longsword being a knightly sword used by the nobility, that's where it comes from. It actually wasn't the fact that, you know, yes, a commoner could easily purchase a longsword in many instances, all right? Now, when you're carrying a one-handed sword, you've got a free hand, and you don't want to carry a big shield around, buckler, baby. And sword and buckler, my goodness, is just an absolutely brilliant, and I've sparred with people using it. It's very equivalent, sword and buckler versus longsword, which longswords have extra reach, leverage, but this extra defense, my goodness, sword and buckler is brilliant. And as I mentioned, very common historically, so much so that the arming sword is the more common weapon for self-defense, even over the longsword. And one of the other reasons is they are more convenient to wear. I've worn both for hours on end, okay? Even going to medieval fairs wearing swords all day, and the convenience of wearing this arming sword, look, it helps out that Todd, you know, when he sells them, a lot of them come with, you know, nice belts and scabbard sheaths, scabbards. Scabbard if it's made out of wood, sheath is made of leather, but they're mostly synonymous terms now. But anyway, because it's got the attachment point higher on one end, lower on the other, secures it really nice. But anyway, you can get long sword attachments that have similar ways. Arming sword is just so much more convenient to wear. And so the purpose of this video is to try and give a bit of credit back to the brilliant arming sword, and also to showcase that it also depends on the type of arming sword. This one, as you can see here, has such a beautiful blade profile, excellent taper, brilliant weight distribution, that it is easily the best arming sword I've ever owned. Like, definitely comparing it to these other arming swords. And what's interesting, this one looks thicker, like and wider, right? And this one is only a little bit heavier, but the weight is far better in Todd's one than this one that I have here. And I don't even know where this one comes from. I purchased it off another sword collector who offered it to me. Same with this one here. Now, this arming sword is interesting because it does show you kind of like the other extreme that we see here. You can really see it. This is light and very, very nimble. As a result, it doesn't have as much bite in the cut. And when I say light and nimble, it's not like so drastically different to be, you know, unrecognized, like actually pretty similar, right? Surprisingly similar. And so there are, of course, lighter arming swords that, you know, do a brilliant job, but then there are arming swords that are just king. In actual fact, I would even go so far, like, it's personal preference, bias, but this arming swords like this, almost like the ultimate arming sword, in my opinion, so great that it can beat out even two-handed swords that people assume, just because of, I guess, sword culture, the way it's interpreted in pop culture things. They just assume two-handed swords always do more damage than one-handed swords, and that is not the case. It depends on the type of sword. In case you're wondering, we have already put this sword through its paces, okay? But it didn't warrant a dedicated video just on that alone. Dedicated videos need a bit more information, meat, substance to them. But we do have an exclusive video for our supporters where we put this to the test. And it's already available, it's already out. You might have to scroll down a bit because it came out a while ago, but that is available. So if you want to see how seriously full on this is when we put it to the test with cutting and stuff, all you need to do is become a supporter. That's $1 to $5 a month. You can support us here on YouTube through channel memberships, or on Patreon, Subscribestar, or Player. Yes, it is Player now. It used to be YouTube, now Player. And guys, that helps us keep the lights on. I'm not kidding, right? It's only thanks to our supporters I'm able to keep making this content. Thank you to everyone. And so if you want to help us out, and with ad revenue only getting worse, okay? Algorithm not favoring this type of content, sword content, and I'm not the only sword creator that's, I've talked to that's had issues with search and discoverability, impressions and reach and stuff. Yeah, it's only thanks to supporters we're able to keep going. And so not only do you help me keep making the content like this, but also you get awesome exclusive content that I'm able to give back to you guys. And there are loads of really fun, awesome stuff you can check out right now. You can check out this bad boy being put to the test. So thank you to everyone who has watched this video. Really appreciate you. Super thank you to all our supporters, like genuinely, and thank you for watching. So until next time, farewell.